Oh,
So a couple of the softball girls thought Greg was me. They were asking him about.
wait, hold on. No, this USB audio device. Yes, we have games Saturday and Sunday.
Good morning, George Ranch High School Longhorns.
Okay, I don't know why
Today
that.
is
All right.
Tuesday, March 2nd. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance and the pledge to the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now, the pledge to the Texas flag. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state under God, one and indivisible. Please remain standing for this moment of silence. Teachers, please scan your first period for any students out of dress code and send them to their AP office to change. Part of your dress code is properly wearing your mask over nose and mouth. And if they are out of dress code and do not have their mask properly put over their mouth, over their nose and mouth, please send it to their Please make sure you are following all social distancing protocols, including staying to the right with the traffic flow. Even classroom release first, the odd classroom 1 minute later. We want to welcome our newest Longhorns back on campus. This is the start of the 5th 6 weeks. Make sure that you're taking care of your business. And remember, if you can't be kind, be quiet. And remember, have a great day here at George Ranch High School.
What's up? Yes, it's you know the hallway. Who else? Who'd you have? You weren't here as a freshman. I'm the only social studies teacher you've had at this school. Do you know the hallway where the textbook room is? Do you know the hallway directly across from the cafeteria? That like first hallway once you pass the office? Go all the way down there to the right. Why didn't you? Oh. No, I know you took government last semester because they put you in government because they were like, you need a 1 semester social studies credit. Whatever. All right. Moving up in life. Here we go. So if you might have been confused, I don't know, could have been confused, might have been confused, might not care, might not have paid attention at all, just life in general. This was originally due on Friday. Friday was quite the cluster because you were supposed to take a test that the district didn't give you access to, and I wasn't here because I was at a baseball tournament. And so, yeah, you'll take that test on Friday. You should have access now. Burger check this morning, and it's in Skyward the way that it's supposed to be. So that should work. But this is what you were supposed to do on Friday. If you've already done this, that's great. But I'm gonna go ahead and go through the lecture anyway. Okay, it's clearly working. Why is that not working? There we go. Now we're good. Okay, so 1920s, right? Life in the 1920s. 1920s is one of the, I think the 1920s is one of the more interesting time periods in American history because one, the 1920s is sort of a land of excess, right? So y'all are all juniors, yes? have you been in a class yet where they force you to read The Great Gatsby? Is that still like required high school reading? You're literally reading it right now? Okay, so that's the 1920s, right? Like Gatsby is the 1920s. Okay, so you have to sort of understand, right? Like nothing happens in a vacuum, right? Which means that everything is sort of being affected by other things that have occurred, right? So we've just gotten out of the Great War, right? And that's still what it's known sort of internationally at this point. Like it's literally the war to end all wars. World War I is horrific. Like, I mean, like you think people have PTSD now from like being in the military? Like World War I was way worse, way worse. And so now the 1920s, a lot of what happens in the 1920s is born from the result of the war, right? Wanting sort of new freedoms, new senses of sort of joy in life, right? Like obviously war, there's not a lot of joy in war. And we talked about sort of the domestic impacts of World War I, right? Like the great migration of blacks out of the South and up into the North and into factories, because black men now had economic opportunity that they didn't have before then, right? Women went to work because all the white dudes like went to war. That's not to say that black men didn't go to war too. They did, just not necessarily at the exact same like rate as white people. Because whatever. There's obviously it's still racist. Right? Like, don't really trust black people. The idea of giving a black person a gun still makes a lot of white folk a little uneasy in 1918. All right. But those are going to result in people wanting more freedom. They've had more opportunity. They've been given a little bit more in life. And now when the white guys come home, right, our minority men and our women don't want to give up some of the things that they've had, right? And so one of the things that happens here is we have sort of growing consumer culture. And the 1920s becomes a period of excess, right? People are buying a lot. Do you know what wars do economically? Have we had this conversation? Yes? What do they do, Burger?
Well, I mean, for the people who aren't, and then they can sell like the weapons and ammunition and stuff and make a whole bunch of money off of it.
Yeah.
For the people who are, and then that can cost them a bunch of money to be able to provide clothes and food and all that stuff.
War for the most part, especially the way the United States does war, right? Like the way the US does war, dude, you make so much money. Like, why do you think we go to war all the time? Right? Like literally, we'll talk about this when we get to like the end of this semester, right? And like all of the wars that the United States has been in. War provides an opportunity, it's an economic opportunity. You make a lot of money, right? You can make a lot of money in war. And so the economic increases, right, that resulted from war because we're producing a whole bunch of stuff and we're paying people, right, because people have jobs, they're working in the factories are paying overtime, people have excess cash, they're going to go spend that excess cash. Like that stimulates economic growth massively, right? And so there's a common misconception, a very common misconception, that when economic growth occurs, that it will just continue forever, right? Like that's why people, specifically poor people that come into large sums of money, right? Like lottery winners, they all end up broke, right? Because they get this massive windfall of cash and then they start spending thinking that like the cash will still be there. I don't know why they think that, right? But then it's gone. Like professional athletes are sort of the same way. And because professional athletes, especially I mean, all of them, right? Like if you're in the NBA, and I'm just saying, let's just say I'm talking like LeBron, right? Like you are average NBA player, just average, right? You're probably making $8-9 million a year. Okay. Now, what you don't realize is these guys are going to make this money for 7-8 years, maybe, right? But when you're 23, 24, 25 years old, you don't realize like, oh, I'm only gonna have this job for 6 years, right? And so they just think, well, I make 8 million a year. Like that's my salary. That's what I make. When I'm 40, I'm gonna make 8 million a year. No, you're not, dude. You're not. Unless you're Tom Brady. That's not happening. Right? Okay, by the time you hit 40, you are making significantly less. Okay? But so people continue to buy. And because people think that they're going to continue to make money, right? Because the economy was growing and everything was going great, they buy on credit. You know what credit is? Money you don't have. Like I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. Well, today is Tuesday, right? Like I will the what was the dude's name from you see this is how I'm gonna date myself now, right? Like the old Popeye cartoons. But and they were old when I was a kid. Right? But like there was a little dude that was Popeye's friend who was like a bum. And he would be like, I would gladly pay you Friday for a hamburger today. Right? Because people are spending money that they don't have. Okay. The 1920s also increases or there's significant changes to sort of culture in the United States, right? So movies become a thing in the 1920s, like mass popular culture ideology. I mean, you're talking maybe I don't know, probably there were probably weeks where you had 100 million tickets sold to movies, right? And the population of the United States at that point wasn't like 100 million, right? Because you might have people going to see like double features, like that was an old thing, like old thing where you get like you buy 2 tickets to 2 movies and you watch 2 movies. Because people back in the day, people used to be able to sit for like 4 straight hours and watch movies. Actually, were 2 hours long back then. They were closer to like an hour 15, right? But like people could sit, they would sit that long and just watch like 2 movies back to back because ADHD hadn't been invented yet. No, I mean it really hadn't, right? Like ADHD. Well, we don't need to get into like social science stuff and how ADHD is a result of like culture. And but this new national culture that arises in the 1920s, coming out of World War I, right? The U.S. has sort of made a name for itself on a world stage. Because obviously we're part of the victors in World War I. You have radio, which becomes a massive sort of communication tool. Like if there's one thing that you want to control in order to sort of control the population and the masses and the people, it's communication, right? Like if you can control communication, like the people are literally just like pawns to your little game. Okay? Radio becomes this thing that sort of everybody has, right? Like radios are relatively inexpensive, and for the time period, and it's free, right? Like literally, you just turn the radio on, and then you pick up, like you tune the little dial in, because it has like the little knobs. You tune it in, and you pick up, the Grand Ole Opry, right, out of Nashville, which is obviously still a radio show today. Grand Ole Opry is if you ever go to Nashville and you play tour the Grand Ole Opry, it is a live radio show today, right? Like literally, they have musicians out there to play. They come out and play. Some of them that just work for the Opry all the time. Some of them that are like big country stars. But if you ever like sit in the audience at the Grand Ole Opry, like there's a dude in the corner. I don't want to say the corner, like the side of the stage, that has like a little microphone who reads the ads, like the commercials. You reading the commercials because it's all part of a radio broadcast, right? Because radio in the 1920s is when radio like reaches everybody, right? Like people are sitting there listening to baseball games on the radio, right? Like baseball is huge because leisure and entertainment in the 1920s becomes huge, right? Like people have literally just lived through the worst thing in sort of the worst thing imaginable. And so at that point, like when life sucks, what do you want to do? Like seriously, think about it. Like if you're having a bad day, right? Like if you're having a bad day, life sucks for you individually on a given day. Like, what is it that you go and do, right? You try to go and find something that's fun, that's relaxing, right? That's leisure, to get your mind off of it. You don't want to think about how terrible it is, right? You don't want to think, like, when you get off work at 6 o'clock, you don't want to be like, I got to go back to that factory tomorrow, right? And breathe in all that dirty air and work another 10-hour shift for $3 or whatever they're making in 1920. You don't want to think about that. Instead, you're like, hey, I just made it through a war. I'm like 25 years old. I'm gonna go find me a honey. We're gonna go out dancing, drinking, like that's what you want to go and do. That's what The Great Gatsby is sort of about, right? Like that book sort of talks about the idea of excess and like leisure and partying and fun, and that's really what it is. When I was in high school, I basically had my U.S. history teacher told us that the 1920s was like the greatest like kegger ever, right? Like rager, right? The greatest party ever. And the 1930s was the hangover, right? And that's really what it becomes, and that's ultimately what it is. Also in the 1920s, right, we have some significant technological innovations, right? So the Wright brothers from Ohio, right? Like they make an airplane, they take it over to North Carolina, because North Carolina's got like rolling hills rather than like more mountainous areas. It's kind of nice, a little bit easier to fly in North Carolina, kind of just roll it down the hill and then you get some drag and you get takeoff and whatnot. Aircraft existed in World War One, but it will be something that by World War II makes a huge difference, right? And that's you're really talking 20 years, okay? Aircraft exists in World War One, but it's not like the game changer that it will be. You do have some other significant advantages though with flying, right? So Lindbergh makes the first transatlantic flight, right? He flies across the Atlantic Ocean, and this drastically decreases travel times. Right? Just like the railroad, when we connected the East Coast and the West Coast of the railroad, all of a sudden you had mass migrations because it became easier to travel. Increases in travel or decreases in travel time, right? Like increases in travel technology help open up all sorts of things, whether it just be leisure travel, right? Or open up new markets. But this is an opportunity for more sort of intermingling of cultures, of countries. Lindbergh flew from, if memory serves, New York City to Paris, right? And that's the Spirit of St. Louis. That was the name of his plane. Amelia Earhart is the first woman to make that transatlantic flight, right? First female to do it roughly the same time. I think it was a little over a year later, right? What's up?
How would you be able to take off? But then you say like North Carolina,
That's the difference. So the Wright brothers are don't have a like, yeah, right. So like they don't have an engine to create the thrust yet. They're really looking at aerodynamics and drag. And like I mean not that y'all need to understand this, but like if you ever wanted to be a pilot, it's almost counterintuitive, right? Like you actually want to take off. You want to take off an airplane with the wind in your face, believe it or not, right? And you want to land an airplane with the wind behind you, which you would think would be like, well, that like I'm gonna get dragged. I need to pick up a lot of speed on a plane, so like I don't want the wind in front of me because that's gonna slow me down, right? That's wind drag. But what happens is you start going faster and faster, obviously, and you've already got wind coming this way. The wind goes up under the wings, and that's what creates lift. Okay. So once like Lindbergh and Earhart have propellered airplanes, right? Like engined airplanes. The Wrights, one of the early Wright airplanes was like a bicycle, right? Like literally they were sitting there pedaling. And because I want to say they were doing it at the end of the 1800s, right? Like I think their first attempt at flight was like 1898, right? So by the time you get to the 1920s, now you have engines, and part of that comes from like automobiles, right? Interestingly enough, automobiles are also sort of a byproduct. They're an accident. They're an accident in the sense that gasoline is an accident, right? So the gasoline engine, gas is a byproduct, basically of taking oil and trying to create fuel to like run lamps and things like that. Gasoline becomes a byproduct of that. So now we have this, and what are we going to do with it? Well, we create a combustible gas engine. Okay. Ford and the Model T, like the 1920s creates that assembly line process. I mean, the 1920s doesn't create the assembly line process. The assembly line exists before the 1920s. But Ford sort of perfects it, right? Ford perfects this assembly line process where everybody does like one really, really easy repetitive job over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? To where literally, then if you go look at like car plants today, there's literally a guy who just stamps out like the hood of your automobile, right? Like some sheet metal comes in and he's got the little lever and he pulls it down and the machine like stamps down and it curves the hood, right? And it puts little ridges in it and it cuts off the excess. And then he picks the hood up and like sets it on the belt or sets it on the thing and it moves off to somebody else. That's all he does, right? He doesn't do anything else, right? He doesn't paint it, he doesn't polish it, he doesn't attach it, he doesn't weld the little hinges on, like that's it. He just stamps out the hood itself, right? So Ford and the Model T is the creation of sort of mass-produced automobiles, right? So one, like they're all pretty much the same, but two, because you mass-produce this, guess what happens to the cost? Cost goes down, right? So everybody in the United States has a car. Okay? Prior to like the mass production of the Model T, cars existed, right? Automobiles existed, but in reality, the only people that had automobiles were rich folks because they basically had to employ their own mechanic as well. Like you had to be super rich and you would have a mechanic and a driver, sometimes the same person, right? That would take care of that car for you and then sort of chauffeur you around because they weren't reliable. The Model T and Ford and the assembly line process, it becomes reliable. And you can buy a car in like, it's like 2 months salary. Right? Two months salary. That's it. 2 months, right? Your average automobile today is like 15 months salary, right? Because that's a good way for you to understand or to try to understand economics, right? And sort of costs and inflation. I think it falls on deaf ears if I told you that like, oh, a car in 1922, right? A car costs $300, right? Because you're like, well, I don't know what $300 is in 1922, right? Like what did a hamburger cost in 1922? Like a nickel, right? Well, now you're gonna make me do math. Like, okay, a hamburger was a nickel then, now it's $5, right? Like, doesn't really work that way. Right? So it's better for you to understand like a car was 2 months salary, right? A house was like 20 months salary, right? So what the average person made in 20 months was the cost of a house. What the average person made in 2 months was the cost of an automobile, right? Now, obviously, you have a whole bunch of other expenses and costs as well. You don't work for 2 months and then buy a car because, you got to buy groceries and, electricity and all those other things, okay? But it does, and the U.S., you still have to remember, too, that in the 1920s, the U.S. still has a significant amount of land, right? Like, the U.S. is massive, and I think a lot of us don't really understand that because we sort of think of ourselves as sort of a European type nation, right? Because obviously we were an English colony, right? Like we're our sort of tradition, our roots, our history comes from Europe. But the United States really isn't comparable to Europe in a whole lot of ways, right? And one of them is that if you were to just look at a map, right, or look at a globe, and you were to compare the United States to all of Europe, minus Russia, right, what do you find? Europe is smaller in terms of landmass. Okay, I think England is twice the size of the state of New Jersey. Jersey, which is one of our small states. Okay, so we have massive, massive amounts of open land, right? Like literally, I don't know if it's still an expression now, but like people used to just go get in a car on Sunday and you'd go out for a Sunday drive. Like just get in the car and drive. Leisure activity. We're just going to go see the countryside, right? Americans become sort of obsessed with car culture, and I think it's beginning to change. But even up and through my generation, right? Like I think for you guys, if I asked you to pick between your cell phone and a car, my guess is most of you would go with your phone, wouldn't you? Probably. I said most, not everybody. I promise you, my generation, do we take the car? Like hands down, no questions asked. We're taking the car. Cars were a symbol of freedom, right? I mean, literally, like people, like some of y'all, because I know some of y'all, you're like 17 and before you get your driver's license, right? Like literally, when I was in high school, people left the morning of their 16th birthday to go to the DMV or to go to the DPS or whatever you call it here and get the driver's license. Like you wanted your driver's license the day you turned 16. They taught driver's ed in high school so that you could get your learner's permit as a class in high school so that you could start driving, right? Car culture is a significant part of American culture. And interestingly enough, car culture in the 1920s also then trickles over into some other things, right? And because what let's just stereotype for a second, right? What do two 17-year-olds do in a car when they're unsupervised? Keep your mouth shut. Just think about it. Don't actually say the answer, right? That becomes a significant part of culture as well. Okay, and obviously, like, that's why you have there's this stereotype of women in the 1920s, the flappers, right? Like that's what they're called. They wore shorter dresses, right, and sort of like spaghetti straps, and they looked promiscuous, right? They looked like women of lower morals, right? Because obviously, it probably wouldn't surprise you at all that there's double standards, because we still have double standards in terms of morality with women today. So of course we would have double standards in terms of morality with women then. Okay? In fact, if you actually look sort of historically, women are, and I think we've actually talked about this already with the temperance movement, right, and the industrialization. Women are sort of the keepers of morality within American culture, right? And so when immoral behavior happens, well, we blame the women because men are just kind of animals, right? So it's the woman's fault when immoral behavior happens because they're supposed to be the chaste, pure, moral ones. Sports obviously becomes a big thing. Again, leisure, whether it's sports, it's movies. You know, baseball is a big deal. Baseball is huge at this point. Boxing as a spectator sport is really big. All of this stuff is broadcast on the radios, right? So you can listen to your radio and hear all sorts of athletic events, right? They attract pretty big crowds, and there's something that are accessible to lower classes, right? Which is what really makes some of these spectator sports, some of these leisure activities really, really popular, because now you can literally get like, you know, a penny ticket to go to a White Sox game and you just sit like way far away from the action. Now, like rich folks are still going and they're in the good seats. You know what I'm saying? Like they're right behind the dugout or right behind home plate, right? But poor people can still get in. they can still watch, they can still cheer, they can, you know, come out with a quarter or whatever and get a hot dog and a ticket, right? And maybe, I don't know, maybe a beer or whatever it is that they were drinking back then. I mean, Coca-Cola was around at this point. Although back then, Coca-Cola had cocaine in it. So. That was with cocaine. Excuse me for a second. Baker. Yeah, give me a minute. I'm teaching. I'm actually working today. Shocking, right? And he just hung up. Okay, so again, part of the leisure, part of the culture, the jazz age begins in the 1920s, right? So you have jazz clubs. Music again is really important. Obviously, radio is big. So what are the things that you can put on radio, right? Music is obviously a very, very simple answer. It's real easy to have music on the radio. Now, believe it or not, like radio, like they have soap operas on the radio back in like the 1930s and 40s. Do y'all know that? Like soap operas, like they would have basically actors like reading plays, like reading a script. One of them, and I forget the name of it, like it freaked people out because they thought there was an actual alien invasion. Like they thought that the soap opera was a news program and like aliens had actually landed. Okay. What? Okay. So the 20s, and jazz, again, it's part of the culture. So, you know, you have like the flappers, you have the sort of prohibition, right? And all of that lends itself, or all of that becomes a part of jazz, right? This new sort of form of music that is far more upbeat, right? The tempo is faster. The notes are sort of more pronounced than anything that's happened sort of musically prior to this point, right? It's less formal, right? So did y'all's advisories actually show the Louis Armstrong video the last week? No. Louis Armstrong was a famous jazz musician, right? And that video talked about, amongst other things, about scatting, which is basically the idea of playing with no sheet music. It's just putting notes together. It's very impromptu. It's freehand. It's lacking structure, right? Which is really what the 1920s is sort of about. And obviously, anytime you have this, and especially amongst the younger generations, you realize what the older people do, right? No. Okay. Do old people complain about you and your generation and your lack of morals, right? And you know you're obsessed with your phones and like the old people complain, right? And the old people complained about jazz and baseball and leisure activities. Yes, they did. Jazz was the devil's music because you had these unmarried men and women out in clubs dancing with loud music. Because apparently old people think hell must just be ridiculously loud, right? Like I guess like in addition, I guess old people, like the older you get, apparently the louder you think hell is, and because old people always complain about, oh, it's so loud, right? Like think about it, like 1980s, right? In 1980s, when you had that heavy metal music, oh, stank. Heavy metal music, like you know, Pantera is satanic, right? It's loud. I don't know, right? But jazz is loud. It's played loudly, right? And so there's obviously a lot of blowback on that. There's a lot of the older generations. Well, that's not how we do things, right? Like that's not our culture, our civilized aspect, right? But the 1920s is huge in all of that, right? And then there is what's up?
Wait, why did old people get out of baseball?
Well, they were mad at baseball because they're mad at leisure time, right? Like, so there was an old joke when I was a kid, right? There was an old joke that, you know, like our parents had to walk to school, right? Barefoot in the snow, uphill, both ways, right? Because like older people were like, oh, we had it so much harder, right? Like, oh, it's so much hard. Like I mean, you even hear people in my generation that are like, oh, it's so easy. Like, I disagree. I think, like, on some level, your generation is the toughest generation to grow up in, right? Now, there's certain things that are significantly easier for you, don't get me wrong, but there are other things, lots of things, that are significantly more difficult, right? But, so, I mean, think about it, because you don't have lights on stadiums yet, right? There's no lighting for baseball. So when is baseball played? During the day. Which means you have people leaving work to go to a baseball game in the middle of the day. Well, hey, no, in 1890, man, I was working in the factory. I was working 12 hours a day. Like, we didn't have electricity. There was no lights in there. People were losing fingers in the machines. Like, you got it so easy. Like, that's why they're complaining, right? I kind of hinted at this already when we talked about sort of the car culture and automobiles, right? But obviously, again, just don't shout anything out, right? If you think about like what two 17-year-olds might do in a car, right, when they're unsupervised, you probably realize that something else needs to happen to ensure that a different thing doesn't happen 9 months later, right? Which is where somebody like Margaret Sanger comes in, okay? Because obviously, if you have a little bit more promiscuity, right? If you have some shifts in culture to where, like, you know, you don't get married at 16 and then pop out like 12 children, 6 of which make it to adulthood, right? Because the other 6 died when they were like really young, right? Maybe they got eaten by a snake or fell into a river or whatever. You got 12 kids. Look, I got 3 kids, and it's hard to keep an eye on all 3 of them. If I had 12, they ain't all gonna make it. I'm just saying, right? But no, I mean, like, you just didn't have modern medicine at the time. You know what I'm saying? Like, you'd like the. It's actually funny because I think there's a misconception here too, right? Like, if you look at like life expectancy, right? And people are like, oh, people live so much longer today than they used to. That's actually not true. Right? Like, if you made it to adulthood, you've lived as long as you do today for the most part.
Oh, so it's just like,
The problem is life expectancy took into account all of the children that died. Like, oh, you died at 3. Because here's the thing. If you have 2 people, one of them dies at 3 and the other one dies at 67, what's the life expectancy? 35. 35 is your life expectancy. Like, that dude lived until 67. Like, he almost in his 70s. Like, you can't tell me that, like, 30, like, everyone died at 35. No. Right? Because you had the 3-year-old that died at 3, like, that makes that drags that number down significantly, right? And childhood mortality rates are relatively significant up through this time period. They're actually still significant in some parts of the world today, right? Luckily, the United States isn't one of those. Freud is a part of this too. Anybody in here taking AP Psych? Y'all learn about Freud? Yeah? Freud is like the father of modern psychology. I'm not going to go into it too much with Freud. Weird dude. Apparently had a crush on his mom, I guess. I don't really know. Yeah, super sort of creepy. But obviously, it plays it and probably from a lot of historical accounts that I read, probably a cocaine addict. But, you know, it's also the 1920s. But sort of there's new understandings in terms of like sexuality and things like that, to where, you know, for the most part, I mean, we lived in sort of a more religious society, a more sort of structured society. You know, sex was for procreation, right? Like, you had sex in order to have a child so that you could have help on the farm, right? Like, literally, I mean, I hate to say it, I'm a father, so I'll say it, right? But basically, you have kids so that you can have like slave labor, right? Because you ain't got to pay, right? So like, I can't wait until my daughter's like 2 years older and she can start vacuuming the house, right? I'm kidding. I have a Roomba. She'll do the dishes, and but like that's now in the 1920s, like people have sex for fun, not just to get pregnant, right? Which is obviously a significant change. And again, obviously, there's a lot of blowback on this as well, right? Anytime you have sort of significant shifts, significant cultural shifts, that's going to create a whole lot of blowback. Just like when we've talked about a couple of times with like massive waves of immigration, then you see that massive increase in nativism, right? Like we only like the people that have been here for a long time. We don't like immigrants, right? Now we have this new shift in culture, and then your older generations are like, no, we need traditional values in America, right? New women at the time, we're going to talk about flappers, right? They're also new women in the sense that they finally have a little bit of political equality, right? Women received the right to vote in 1919 with the 19th Amendment. Okay, so the passage of the 19th Amendment affords women the right to vote, which is pretty big for them. All right. I mean, flappers are the group that's associated with the 20s, but obviously those are predominantly the younger women, right? Again, like I said, there's the older generations aren't necessarily buying into all of this sort of new culture. We talked about women having new economic opportunities, right, as a result of World War I. They go to work in the factories. Many of them afterwards, many of them do sort of return to, I mean, what we can just call traditional gender roles for lack of a better term, right? Traditional gender roles. They go back and work in the house. Doesn't mean that they don't necessarily take jobs, especially women of color, right? A lot of the times women of color have to take jobs. They have to find work, but they engage in work that is, again, still very stereotypically feminine work, right? You know, they take in laundry, so they do other people's laundry, or they work as like a seamstress. They'll sew, or they'll fix other people's clothes, or just make other people's clothes. They'll work as like cooks in other people's houses, or housekeepers, things like that. We talked about the Great Migration. Again, so during the Great Migration really begins during World War I, when Black men sort of moved north. This Great Migration, depending on what history book you read, we might have had 3 for Black people, right? Like a mass exodus right after the Civil War, then this one, and then ironically World War II is another. This one is a mass exodus north, right? So Black people are leaving the South and moving north, predominantly to Chicago, Pittsburgh, New York, are major cities. It's relatively easy to find housing, right? Housing is relatively cheap. It's pretty crappy, but it's relatively cheap. And it's relatively easy to find work in a factory. The NAACP is also created, I believe it was actually in 1920. Do I have it in my notes? No, 1910, excuse me. So the NAACP is created in 1910, again, as an organization that's aimed at advancing sort of equality or equitable rights for Blacks, economic opportunity for Blacks, trying to afford them the same sort of opportunities that white men have at the time, right? And you'll learn next year when you get into government, when we talk about sort of equality, and what we mean when we talk about equality in the United States and what type of equality we're trying to achieve. But that's really what the NAACP is working for here. The Harlem Renaissance, there's actually a poster back there. The Harlem Renaissance is a fascinating sort of point in American history. So as I told you a second ago, a lot of the Great Migration, obviously with Chicago, Pittsburgh, there's work there, Cleveland. They go to major cities, but a lot of them go into Harlem, right, into New York City, and it creates a predominant Black culture of the time. Jazz music and nightclubs in Harlem are very prominent. There are less sort of societal constraints on people within Harlem because morality is also sort of generally a tool of the wealthy, right? Because women who are sort of forced to work are sort of seen as being possibly of looser morals because they're walking on the street, and they're unaccompanied by a man, and that's asking for trouble or whatever, right? But in poorer neighborhoods, like that has to happen because they're going to or from work, right? Like they don't have the same sort of economic opportunity to sit at home in their plush little apartment and raise their children and teach their children their colors and ABCs and that sort of stuff. Langston Hughes is, if you've never read Langston Hughes is one of the best poets in American history. I don't know of many writers, specifically poets, that are better than Langston Hughes. And what I'll do tomorrow for you is, I don't know if they cancel the SAT tomorrow. I have no idea. We got an email. Yeah, I know you're looking at me like what? We literally got an email last night that said the SAT might be canceled, might be postponed. I don't know. No. I'm like, literally, why would you tell somebody that? Like, that's the dumbest thing. Like, we might do this, but then again, we might not. Don't study for SAT. I never studied for SAT. No, I studied for an SAT. Zora Neale Hurston is just another sort of prominent African American writer, and Hurston is pretty good because she is obviously a woman, and I know I've got at least one Zora Neale Hurston novel over there, unless I took all my novels back. Maybe I took all my novels back. I don't know. But Hughes and Hurston are very indicative of sort of the literary aspect. That being said, like, don't think of the Harlem Renaissance as just being literary. It's artistic in sort of all regards, right? And really in Harlem, like, Blacks create their own sort of thriving culture. I mean, you have Black-owned businesses in Harlem. You have Black entrepreneurs, people that create new technologies, new ways of doing things, things that are catered specifically toward the sort of African American community, right? I mean, I don't know if y'all think about it, right? But if you go just buy like plain old Band-Aids, what color are they? Flesh, right? Like, that's actually what it's called, right? Like, look at it, flesh color, right? So that way, if you have to have a Band-Aid one, like, people don't notice because it just kind of blends in because it's the color of your skin. Is that true for Black people? No, certainly not, right? Because things weren't necessarily made with minorities in mind. They were made for whites. Well, in Harlem at this time, you have products that are made specifically in mind for like Black people. Like Black people's hair. You don't tell Black people this, they know, right? Like some white people have no idea. Like, their hair is just different, right? Like the type of products that they need in order to style their hair or care for their hair are very different than what white folks need, right? And so now I'm drawing a blank on the woman's name, but you have like the first sort of line of beauty products made for and marketed to Black people around this time so that they have things that are actually like for them, right? That help them, you know, style and things like that. Marcus Garvey is probably at least somewhat important to understand. Garvey is working sort of outside of sort of the aspects of the NAACP, but Garvey is his big point here, his big idea, is basically not to have blacks assimilate into American culture. He doesn't want to see that at all. In fact, he wants to see the recolonization of Africa by blacks. So Garvey is sort of advocating for all black people in the United States to leave and return to Africa, which, I mean, I've always found kind of ludicrous because, you know, if you're a third, like let's even say you're a third generation slave, you know what I mean? Like your grandparents were slaves, right? And now it's 1920 and you're, you know, 20 years old or whatever. Right, and your parents were the first ones to be born free in the United States, and your grandparents were slaves. Like, you still don't know anything about Africa. I mean, you probably heard stories, but you probably never traveled there. You've probably never been there. You don't know what it's really like. I don't know why somebody would give up the home that they know for one that they don't know. I mean, now obviously, I'm also saying that as a white guy who wasn't wildly discriminated against and possibly like hung in the streets. So, you know, there's obviously that aspect too, but that's sort of Garvey's big idea, right? Is he, and it's not like he's militant about it. I don't want you to think that. I think sometimes there's a misconception about that, about sort of how militant, you know, some aspects of sort of black rights and black culture can be. He's really not. It's just more of an idea of maintaining sort of the policy of separate but equal that's already in existence, right? So separate but equal is created with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Garvey is basically saying, look, if you're going to keep us separate, like, let's just go ahead and embrace that. We'll be separate. We'll have our own culture. We'll strengthen our culture, and we'll go back to Africa where we can build our culture free of like Jim Crow laws and things like that systemically limited the opportunity for black people, right? Sort of the modernist revolt here. So there's a lot of sort of changes in thought around this time as well. Obviously, Einstein wins Nobel Prize in 21, and so that's a significant aspect. But modernism is this new sort of post-war ideology. The Lost Generation, again, this is just sort of literature based. So this is the white aspect of literature. These are people that went to Europe during the war and sort of stay there. I mean, people like F. Scott Fitzgerald, right, is writing the Great Gatsby in part as a critique of the sort of era of excess, right? That being said, I mean, Scott Fitzgerald also drank like a fifth of gin every day, so I guess he knows about excess. But there we go. So we're going to kind of fly through the last slide here on modernism. But there you go. If you've got any questions, let me know. The quiz is open for today now. So have a wonderful day. Bye, guys.